the Age of Discovery started in the 15th century, but it had its roots 3 centuries before that, maybe even 4 centuries before that, with the Crusades, that series of adventures embarked upon by European Christians from various different countries, different kingdoms, into the Middle East, into Palestine, the quote unquote the Holy Land, to reclaim it and take it away from the infidel, from the Muslim peoples who were living in that area. So lots of intense fighting over a long period of time. However, it was also an expansion of the European worldview, of the average European's perception and understanding and experience of the wider world. So lots of nobles went on these, sometimes kings went on them, and they took armies with them. So if the king's taking his army, that means he's taking his nobles, who are taking their knights. And a lot of times the knights also took their army, some of their just regular peasants along to do the fighting. So when they got to the Middle East, in addition to fighting against Muslims, taking cities, losing cities, and so on and so forth, they also encountered a lot of new things, things that were wonderful luxuries, things which the peoples of the Muslim world and the Arabic world had access to, like coffee and sugar and cinnamon and various other things, which I shouldn't be mean about English food, but traditionally prepared, it can be kind of bland, as well as a lot of these things were good for being preservatives as well. So a lot of this stuff, European people, experienced for the first time, developed a liking for, and wanted to be able to get more of in the years that followed. Now, this stuff was mostly coming from other parts of the world, and it was winding up in the Middle East. So what the Europeans wound up wanting were various spices that were coming from India, and other spices, as well as things like silks and porcelain that were coming from China. Now, the Chinese had been sending materials toward Europe for centuries, since about 200 BC, on the Silk Road. So this map here shows a lot of different things. This is a map actually of the Silk routes. So there are several different routes through which Chinese goods made it to the Middle East, and from the Middle East to Europe. The Silk Road is the red line right across the top that goes from left to right, or actually from right to left, from east to west. That was a connection that they had actually with the Roman Republic once upon a time. Things had kind of gone up and down depending on the politics in Europe and in the areas of Central Asia through which this road passed. But stuff was coming from China and winding up in Europe, but it wasn't going directly to Europe. Let's take another look at this map. These things that they wanted, in order to get to Europe, had to pass, in order to start in the east and end up in the west, they had to go through the middle. They had to go through the Middle East. So the trade was actually between Asians and Arabs for the most part. And then from there, the trade went from the Muslim world to the European world with a significant markup, both because literally the middlemen, wanted to make a profit, and there's also that crusading business that's ultimately, it turns out, not good for business. So the Europeans, in order to get access at more affordable prices to these things from the East, wanted to bypass the Middle East and deal directly with people in India and China, which the English called Cathay back then, and various other places. Now, this is the world as it existed, the Eastern Hemisphere, in circa 1200 AD, which was around the time some of these crusades were going on. Later on in the 13th century, by 1279, the Mongol Empire, which had been pretty small at the beginning of that century, had expanded quite a bit, as you can see, and it covered most of Asia, all the way into Eastern Europe. Well, that's not good if you're in Europe and you don't want to be invaded by Mongols. Also, it's not good if you were in South Asia or Southeastern Asia and you don't want to be invaded by Mongols, because they have access to the resources of all these places they conquered, right? Which makes them increasingly more powerful. So that's not a good thing. On the other hand, if you're a European. On the other hand, if you're a European and you want direct access to China, that Mongol Empire actually is a good thing, especially after 1279, when they conquered the Song dynasty and took over China as well. What that means is that to pass from Europe all the way to China, you don't have to negotiate your way through a bunch of different little countries, each one of which might deny you entry. It's only one country. It's one empire. So if you get permission from the emperor of that empire, you could walk to China, basically. And for a brief time, when the Mongol Empire was at its height and controlled all that much territory, there were a handful of Italian merchants who did make that trip. Maybe you've heard of this guy, Marco Polo. That's the circumstances in which he was able to go and meet Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor of China at that time. However, that didn't last very long. The Mongol Empire broke up into a bunch of little pieces, and those little pieces were taken over by different groups, different people, so that eventually the whole area was in control, once again, of various Muslim powers, so that, they don't want you to break their monopoly, so you're not going to be able to walk there anymore. So you'll have to find, if you want direct access to China and India, you have to find another route. Now, here's the big problem for Europeans by the late 1300s, and that is, this was their known world. This was the area about which they had maps and knew what was there. Essentially, Europe and areas, the northern coast of Africa, along the Mediterranean, and a little bit into Central Asia and down into Saudi Arabia a little bit, and Palestine, those places where they had gone a-crusading before that. India, they knew vaguely, is out there somewhere around the region where I have the name. And China, they know, is much farther to the east than that. No idea how to actually get there. However, pretty clear they can't get there by land. So there was some hope that they might be able to get there by sea. Now, by this time period into the 14th century, Italy had made some significant nautical advances, kind of by necessity. Now let's take a look at some basic ships in the European tradition. There on the upper left, we have an ancient Greek ship. In the upper right, we have a Roman ship, and you can see the design hasn't changed that much, and Egyptian ships looked about the same. A big square sail, sometimes a smaller square sail in the front. Lower left, that is a Viking ship from around the 10th century. Also, a square sail. Well, in the Mediterranean for centuries, almost 1,000 years by this point, not just in the Mediterranean, but also in China, the Indian Ocean, and the Mediterranean, the various Muslim powers and their navies had been using these triangular sails for some time. Pretty good for zipping around the Mediterranean. The advantage of these is that the back end of this triangular sail, you can move it side to side, so you can catch the wind. That's the disadvantage of the big square sail. If there's a strong wind, poof, along you go. As long as the wind's blowing. If the wind dies down, you're stuck. Or if the wind changes direction. If it starts blowing the opposite direction, you're really stuck. With this triangular sail, you can make little adjustments to it and catch the wind. That will allow you to tack, T-A-C-K, into the wind. So you can actually travel straight, well, not straight, but you can travel into the wind by kind of adjusting your sail and catching it on the side and going over to the left and then going over to the right and then to the left, kind of zigzagging. That's called tacking. In Italy, the city-states along the coast of Italy had for centuries been having to defend themselves against the navies of the various Muslim powers. And so they picked up the use of these sails, which had actually been, to some degree, used by the Romans, but had never really been used that much in Western Europe. So other Europeans started calling this sail design Latine, for Latin, because the Italians were doing it, which is kind of unfair because the Italians were just the first Europeans to borrow it from the people who had been doing it for many years. Anyway, Italian navies got really, really good because they had to be, because they were constantly fighting against the Muslim navies. So there became a tradition of Italian navigators. And all this is leading us up to the early 15th century and some very significant technological advances that are going to change everything. By the way, I thought I should probably show you an image to demonstrate what tacking means rather than just explaining it. So you can see here the wind is blowing downward, blowing from the top, and the tack is when you change the sail around so that you're zigzagging. And if you're not aware of these nautical terms, starboard means right and port means left. So you may find yourself asking, the starboard tack, if starboard means right, why are they going left? Well, the starboard tack, that means that the sail is adjusted so it's catching the wind from the right side and that blows it to the left. Okay, so that's tacking. That's a way you can go against the wind without going directly into the wind. That's also where we get the expression taking a different tack. All the time I see people not so much in papers, because I think a lot of students in the 21st century have never heard this expression, but you see it a lot in media. And I frequently see people misspell that as T-A-C-T, or pronounce it that way. It's not taking a different tact. It's taking a different tack. So what it means to take a different tack, this isn't working the way we're doing it. We need to take a different tack. That means going straight ahead isn't working. We need to hit it from a different angle. All right, well, back to those inventions. those inventions were these three things: the compass, so that you could tell where you were; the quadrant, so that you could figure out where you were going; and the caravel, so you could get there. The caravel was a new type of sea vessel. It was very light and kind of small, therefore very maneuverable and fast, and it had not one lateen sail, but several lateen sails, so that wherever you were, whichever way the wind was blowing, you would be able to catch it in some way, and that would enable you to keep going and enable you to do that tacking. And because it was so light, you were able to not only go against the wind, you were able to travel further, and this was huge. Now, after the caravel, pretty soon after the caravel, there were other ships, new types of ships like the Carack, C-A-R-A-C-K, that had both square and lateen sails, many of them. But it was the caravel that first enabled Europeans to venture farther out into the ocean. Now, not sure how nerdy all of you are, but if you're as nerdy as I am, you're familiar with Sid Meier's Civilization, which is still around. I forget what version is out now, 7 maybe. Anyway, it was initially a computer game, and in it, basically the way it worked was you have this whole new planet with different continents and so forth, and you start off with like one guy and you start exploring, right? And then as you get more advanced, you start inventing new things. And what you would do is that the parts of the map that you had not explored yet were black. Well, before you get to the point of inventing the caravel, if you tried traveling too far out and into the sea with one of those square-rigged single-mast ships, you would go out into the black area, and then your ship would disappear because it has sunk and it would turn black again. But once you get the caravel, why, you can go right up into that black area easily and light it all up and discover new continents. And that's that's a really good way to illustrate how important the caravel was. And the first people to make really good use of it were the Portuguese. Now, talked about how Italian navigation had become very prominent, and there's going to be a lot of explorers who were Italian. But so far as a government getting behind exploration, why, in Italy there was no single government. Each city was its own government. There were city-states. But over in Portugal, he wasn't the king of Portugal. He was a prince, Prince Henry. Maybe you've heard of him from school before, Henry the Navigator. He was one of the people in line to be the king, but he wasn't even first or second, I don't even think, in line. He never became king, but he was very influential, very prominent as a member of the royal family, and was able to convince the king, his relative, to invest money in navigation schools in Portugal, and to invest money in lots of ships, including caravels, so that the Portuguese could start trying to find a sea route to those areas that they wanted to trade with. And in addition to India and China, another valuable commodity that could only reach Europeans through the Muslim population of North Africa was gold from South Africa. So the Portuguese started making these voyages. Now, Henry himself didn't get on a ship and sail across the ocean and discover things, but he was very, very influential in getting this ball rolling around 1400. Well, the first thing that the Portuguese did was start sailing down the west coast of Africa, past their traditional enemies in North Africa to see what lay beyond that, and they encountered the Canary Islands. That's them that are circled right there. On the Canary Islands, there were native people living there who had been there for, well, a really long time, obviously, who had not been in contact with Europeans. So, of course, they took over the Canary Islands. As they started to go a little bit further out, they discovered these other islands. The island of Madeira, for example, which, if you're a wine drinker, Madeira is a type of port wine. Port originally is from Portuguese. Also, the Azores or the Azores, which is a chain of islands. So the Portuguese discovered these, and there were some of the islands had people on them, most of them did not. But they discovered that the climate on these islands made it possible to grow things there that you couldn't grow on the mainland, and that you could previously only get through those brokers in the Middle East. You could grow coffee and sugar on these islands. Well, they started planting people, having settlers go onto these islands, and therefore they were called plantations. And they started growing this stuff, eliminating the middleman. However, they needed labor, and they tried to get hired labor from Portugal, but not too many people were willing to go live on a distant island and just work like dogs for very little pay. So what they did was they started taking the local indigenous people of these islands and the people from the Canary Islands and enslaving them and forcing them to do the labor on these plantations. However, there weren't a whole lot of those people. Those people had, they had issues with, I think, resistance to diseases, and they mostly died out pretty quickly. It didn't help that they were being virtually worked to death. Well, as it turns out, as the Portuguese had been going down the coast of Africa, just below the Canary Islands, they discovered, came into contact with various peoples of West Africa below the Sahara that were a part of a long-established slave trade that had initially been used by the Arabs to take African slaves into the Middle East and North Africa. Well, the Portuguese started buying those African slaves and having them work on these islands. Now, they didn't have to buy a huge number because these islands were pretty small. But guess what's going to happen when the Portuguese and their Spanish frenemies get across the ocean and discover a whole new world full of places where they can grow stuff? They're going to need more and more labor. And so the slave trade that the Portuguese were the first Europeans to tap into is going to just exponentially explode and turn into something that was not even recognizable compared to what it had been before. It becomes so huge and such an important part of the global economy by that point. So, if you think about it just a little bit, you don't have to think too much, you can realize that the environment of those islands that the Portuguese discovered once they had the means to get there, the environment of those islands is going to really alter and affect the whole world after that. It's kind of a linchpin on which this whole new system of doing things develops. Well, we've talked about why the Age of Discovery started, and we've talked about how. Now, let's take a look specifically at the mindset of particularly the English colonists. Now, during the early part of the 16th century, we saw, as you are no doubt aware, the beginning of the Reformation, also called the Protestant Reformation, when throughout Europe, various groups sprang up protesting against the Catholic Church and breaking away from it and forming Protestant denominations. Sometimes whole countries, by decree of their kings, became Protestant instead of Catholic. Well, Spain and France remained Catholic. Some people tried to be Protestant, but didn't work out so well for them. England, however, became Protestant. And English Protestantism was heavily influenced. Well, it depends on what kind of Protestantism you're talking about. So the church in England went from being Catholic to Protestant and became the Church of England, also called Anglican or Episcopalian, still remained similar in many ways to the Catholic Church, but there were those who wanted to go much further and get rid of all those Catholic elements and purify the Church of England. They became known as Puritans, and those Puritans, who would eventually take over the government in England, were heavily influenced by this guy, this Swiss theologian, whose name was actually Jean Calvin. But hey, we're English, we're not saying those dadgum foreign sounds, so they called him John Calvin. Calvin's precepts, which heavily influenced the Puritans, and we may have already touched on some of these things, included the idea that if you work really hard, God will reward you physically. He will reward you financially. That's the Protestant work ethic, the Puritan work ethic. Idle hands are the devil's workshop. You have to be productive. You have to be producing. You have to be active all the time. And Calvin believed in predestination, which is the idea that God already knows what's going to happen to you. Your fate is sealed. You're either a member of the elect and going to heaven, or you're a member of the damned and going to hell, and there's nothing you can do to change it. However, fortunately for you, you don't know which one you are. However, if you work really hard, and this is how the Puritans began to interpret this, other Calvinistic groups didn't go to this extreme completely as far as the Puritans did. If you work really hard and then you achieve success, material success, that is evidence God is with you. Therefore, that's evidence you're probably going to heaven. And so that's a way to let you know it, and sometimes more importantly to you, to let your neighbors know it. Hey, look at me. God's blessing me. That must mean I'm righteous, right? So those types of attitudes led to the attitude that you have to make the most of every resource. You have to use things. They're there to use, and if you're not using them, you're wasting them. Every resource. Now, in Europe, there weren't that many resources left, especially forests. Europe had been heavily deforested in the prior century or so. Well, imagine when these colonists get to the New World, to North America, and there's forests as far as the eye can see. Nothing but forest, it seems like. So it seems like those resources are inexhaustible. So you got to use them all. That's what they're there for. And they're inexhaustible. That means you can just use. Can you see how that might have filtered down culturally into the society that developed out of those English colonies and became the United States? Well, something else that was going on around the time the English started colonizing North America, the Age of Enlightenment, or sometimes just called the Enlightenment, and sometimes called the Age of Reason, which came after what historians have called the Age of Faith. So the Age of Reason, or the scientific revolution. And that included people like Sir Isaac Newton in England, and it also included English philosophers like John Locke. So around the tail end of the Reformation is when the beginning of the Enlightenment was starting, and it kind of hit perfectly that both those things were going on still when England started its colonies in the early 1600s. So, scientific revolution, rationalism, not rely on faith, to not rely on the supernatural, but to rely on your senses and your logic and your reason, the scientific method, right? This is when some of those classical Greek ideas from Aristotle started to be incorporated into European thought. The idea that you develop a hypothesis and you test it out and you have to have evidence for it. Evidentiary. In this view, in the view of Enlightenment thinkers, which was most of the educated people of the time, nature could be understood and it could be controlled. People referred to themselves, scientists referred to themselves as naturalists because they were seeking to understand nature so as to control it. Enlightenment thinkers believed that humanity is constantly progressing, growing in knowledge, and therefore getting better and better. They believe that humanity is above nature, superior to nature, and can dominate it. They believed that nature had to be overcome and dominated in order to improve the human existence. In other words, essentially, without stating that it was coming from God or that it was supernatural, they believed so many of the same things that medieval Christians had believed, except in the place of God, they placed science. Or when they talked about God or the Creator, they were actually talking about nature and science. We'll talk about possibly, well, we may not talk about deism in this class. Anyway, so you may be familiar with the concept of deism that had developed by the 18th century, that God is kind of this distant force that doesn't get directly involved in things. A very Enlightenment way of looking at religion. So since both those things are in process when the English colonies were first formed, then the English colonists were impacted by both the Protestant Reformation, particularly Calvinism, and Enlightenment thinking. Now, there was a lot more Calvinism in the Massachusetts and Plymouth colonies than there was in the Jamestown colonies and later the Carolinas. There's probably more Enlightenment thinking in Jamestown than there was in Massachusetts and Plymouth. But there was some degree of both in both of those places and in the colonies that sprang up around them afterwards. So the basic idea of these English colonists then, whether they are extremely religious and not really into this whole Enlightenment thing, or whether they consider themselves enlightened and aren't that into this religion thing, either way, they believe progress is good. Progress is positive change, and that progress means taming nature, getting human control over it, and it also means using resources to their fullest capability, making maximum use of them. And if you're not using your resources, you're being lazy and wasteful. Well, when they got there, guess who wasn't using up all the resources? The people who were already there. So guess how the English colonists are going to regard those native people and their way of life. All right, well, that's the mindset that European colonists were in when they arrived. Now, we're going to spend some time talking about Native American culture, and since you, I'm assuming, know a lot less about that than you do about European or English culture, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time giving you just a basic primer of Native American culture, Native American approaches to various different things. And in fact, this next section is one kind of the basic Native culture thing that I do in many of my classes, including my early U.S. survey course, my American Indian Studies, westward expansion, environmental history. So it's a little bit longer in the form I'm going to present it than I normally would in class, but I really want you to have an understanding of the culture. And you may at first think, well, what does all of this have to do with environmental history? But the more you listen, I think, the more you will realize that it does.